Throughout the centuries in history, there have been many different execution methods used to condemn a prisoner to death. Some of the most brutal include hanging during a quartering, in which a victim would be hanged until almost dead, then the ordeal got much worse. But inside of castles, there was a cell in a prison, which was incredibly brutal and terrifying, and many people were so terrified of the oubliette. The term oubliette translates from French as to forget, and with this a prisoner was thrown into an oubliette dungeon, where they were simply forgotten and left to succumb to their deaths in the dark and damp cells. But why was the oubliette so brutal? Join us today as we look at this dungeon and one of the most brutal execution methods in history. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. An oubliette came in a number of different forms. Sometimes they were cells which were shaped like a bottle, in which they were only accessible from a hatch or hole in a high ceiling. These were also impossible for someone to escape from, but other oubliettes were tiny cramped cells, built into walls or corridors. They were sometimes built in the walls of upper floors of castles, and victims could hear the sound of everyday life, and this would drive them mad as they were left in the tight conditions. Inside oubliettes the walls were very tight, and this meant that prisoners would only be able to stand or crouch for 24 hours a day. It was too small to sit down comfortably and also stand up, and the pain of crouching constantly would be agony on the back and the legs, but also on the mind. Prisoners were also deprived of food and were slowly starved to death, and were not given any food, but sometimes guards would give them small amounts of food to preserve the suffering of an individual. Prisoners also had to contend with the remains of previous inmates, as corpses and human remains of the prisoner who went before were left inside the oubliette, and often rats and vermin would be feasting on the corpse. These carried disease, and in the future it would be the prisoner who would be next. A number of oubliettes have been found that have been covered in human bones, with victims being left there for centuries. The tight conditions made it truly hell on earth, and to inflict a quicker death, there would be sometimes spikes placed in the dungeon, so the prisoner would be cut and then infection would take them quicker. Also, the guards could throw human excrement and litter into the hole in the ground in the prison, and this would cause disease and infection to bring about death quicker. One example of an oubliette can be found at Oubliette Castle in Ireland, and it's considered one of the most haunted places in the country. This oubliette was built within the castle, and the castle saw much action in the forms of sieges and massacre between different clans who occupied it at different times. Captured members of the rival clans would be thrown inside the oubliette, and at the bottom of the oubliette were many sharp wooden spikes which poked up from the floor, around 8 feet below the trapdoor, which would cause a prisoner to be badly injured when they were dropped in, or many were impaled when they were thrown in, and then they slowly died. There were many different human remains found inside this oubliette, and in the 1920s it took 3 cartloads to transport them away from the castle for burial. One of the most famous prisons and castles in history is the Tower of London, which became a site of torture and execution during the Tudor period. It was where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, 2 of Henry VIII's wives, were executed on Tower Green. But here there was a small and tiny oubliette-style cell known as Little Ease, built into the basement of the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London. Inside this cell, which was built into a wall, it was secured by a door, and then guards would throw a prisoner in there for a number of days, before other tortures were also administered. Guy Fawkes, a gunpowder plotter, was thrown inside of Little Ease after he had been racked, and it's believed this was one thing that helped him turn over his fellow conspirators, as he suffered from the psychological torture. Another oubliette can be found at Warwick Castle, and the castle's dungeon had a strong reputation for the oubliette during the 100 Years' War, and the French soldiers heard of Warwick's dungeon cell. They did not want to end up there. The earliest prisoners of the oubliette were the French soldiers that were captured in battle, but the Warwick oubliette is different. It's seen by going into the prison, in the dungeon of one of the towers, and down the steps in a separate room, which would have been secured by a few doors, is the oubliette. It is a long and horizontal passage that is dug just below the floor. This would have been secured by a grate, and the victim would be forced to lie prone on the stones below that come up from the floor, and they could not move in any manner, as there was hardly any room, and the ceiling would just be a number of inches above. This cell was incredibly claustrophobic, and would have been very warm and clammy. The psychological torture of the oubliette was very severe, as prisoners would not know when they were getting out, if they ever did, and the majority never made it out alive, and were simply forgotten about and left to succumb to the conditions of the small prison cell. Also in the Oubliettes, prison latrines or toilets would often flow into them, which would cause more problems as the victim would regularly be covered in human waste. This is a dungeon where the Oubliette is, in the bottom of Warwick Castle. Absolutely terrifying. If you look behind me, that's up there. There would be a door here, you can see the hinges. There would also be a door here as well, blocking someone in, the hole in the ground. So we are now in the Oubliette. This is a hole in the ground where you definitely didn't want to be during the medieval period. We're at Warwick Castle, and during the 100 Years' War, this hole in the ground was so feared that the French even heard about it back in their homelands. In here, it'd be horrible, there'd be rats, disease, and you'd simply be left to die here. This is a hole in the ground where it was so tight, you couldn't even stand up, sit down or lie down. You'd be starved to death. It'd be absolutely horrible. You definitely did not want to be in the Oubliette. There was a form of the Oubliette which was used in the Second World War, inside of the concentration camps. At sites such as Auschwitz and Dachau, there were standing cells used to torture inmates. These were tiny cells, in which sometimes up to 4 different prisoners were held inside of the dungeon, and there was often only a very small hole for oxygen, and prisoners could be held in there for a number of days. These cells really showed the cruelty of the Nazis, and many people actually compared this to medieval forms of torture. But the Oubliette was one of the most brutal prisons and torture cells used throughout history. Inside, prisoners would be forced to stay in one position for 24 hours a day and would be left to die. It was simple, people were thrown into a hole in the ground and were just forgotten about. Often diseases would bring death quicker, but inside the Oubliette a prisoner would be hoping that death would take them sooner, as it was a horrific form of punishment. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.